Hello, everyone. It's 5 o'clock, so I guess we can go ahead and get started. I'll introduce Sarah very briefly, but Sarah, definitely correct me if I introduce you improperly. But this is Sarah Rovito. She's, I think, currently self-employed. Is that correct? At Rovito Ventures, where you do science and innovation policy consulting. And she was previously an IEEE congressional fellow, working at Seth Moulton's office, so representative in Massachusetts. Forget the district number, but maybe that's less relevant. So anyway, take it away, Sarah.
Sure thing. Everyone can hear me okay?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my slides. All right. So thank you all so much for being here today and for the invitation to speak. Super excited to be here and share what I know and what I love about science policy. So probably the first thing I actually should say is, given my recent tenure on Capitol Hill, if you ever have the opportunity to go on a Capitol Dome tour, absolutely do it. That is where this photo comes from. Seriously, just such a priceless experience. Highly, highly, highly recommend. But anyway, want to expand a little bit more on my background and why I am here speaking with you today. So I really took a very circuitous path to a career in science policy. You see here all the different organizations I've either gone to school at, I've worked with, I've been affiliated with. I really frankly began my career in very technical roles. I'm an engineer by training. I became more interested in science policy over time. And what really I see as my pivot point was, I had the opportunity to come up to MIT and attend the technology and policy program. And that's really where I pivoted from doing very technical work to really embarking upon this new career, working more on the policy side of things. So a little bit more about that. As I mentioned, I'm an engineer by training. My first experience in science policy was through the Washington Internships for Students of Engineering program, which is primarily geared towards undergrads. I believe they do take first-year master's degree students. Don't quote me on that. I do want to point out, however, that everybody who participates in the WISE program is ultimately sponsored by an engineering disciplinary society. And in particular, just in case we happen to have any undergraduates who are chemical engineers here with us on Zoom today, AICHE is still accepting applications for summer 2021 for a few more days. Regrettably, the internship will be virtual this summer on account of COVID-19, but honestly, the silver lining is you can likely participate from anywhere. And again, this was really a transformational experience for me. Having spent 4 years in engineering school, it really opened my eyes to Washington, DC, and policy careers, and even more specifically, science and engineering and technology policy careers. So just want to throw that out there. Since I came back to Washington, DC from MIT, the two jobs I held, I was the Director of Science and Research Policy at the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, of which MIT is a member, and I'm sure many other institutions on the line are members. APLU essentially has roughly 240 member institutions, the bulk of which are public universities. MIT is a special case, which I won't get into on account of the interest of time, but it was really a rewarding opportunity to both work in science policy, but also to really get to know the higher ed community and universities and a lot of the issues that they very much care about with respect to research and education. I really wanted to learn more, however, about how policy is made and specifically how Congress works. And that was what led me to be an IEEE USA Congressional Fellow. This fellowship is under the broader American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. IEEE has always been my professional society, and in fact, they sponsored me when I was a WISE intern as well, so that was kind of a very fun bookend there. As Benjamin shared, I work for Representative Seth Moulton, who is Massachusetts' 6th district, just north of Boston. So he has communities in Lynn, Salem, Swampscott, and again, really enjoyed the opportunity to work for Mr. Moulton and to really have a front row seat to how Congress works. And so for me, the experience really allowed me to see inside the black box and not only get a taste of what it's like to be a legislative assistant, which was really what I was functionally, if you were listening into Jack's presentation, but also, if I do continue to work outside of Congress, having had that experience of being on the other side of the table to ultimately be a more effective advocate for science and technology policy. My career overall, really two main things. I seek to understand how and why government policy decisions are made and how to optimize these decisions. This really frankly goes back to my time supporting the Department of the Navy. I would show up at work and there would be a new information assurance policy on my desk. And I would wonder, how did this get here? How did they decide on the standards? Who even said that we needed to do more in this space? And so that was what led me to be interested in policy, but also thinking about the stakeholders and how we build coalitions and how we reach policy solutions that have maximum benefit and impact and really work for all parties who are involved. Finally, I'm also keenly interested in bridging the communications gap between scientists and engineers and policymakers. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in my presentation, thinking about things like scientific jargon, how do we communicate very clearly, concisely, crisply, succinctly. And I think as Jack and Divyansh both mentioned, so few folks in Congress, both elected members of Congress and staffers, have any sort of degree in science, engineering, technology. How do we speak in a way and use terms that resonate with them and allow them to understand what the facts, what the data, what the evidence are saying? So moving along, today we will touch upon 4 main points with respect to science policy. So science policy, what is it? What are the emergent issues? I'll give you some advocacy tips, a lot of which are very similar to what Divyansh just shared. And I will give you some next steps if this is something that really does appeal to you or you might be interested in making a career in this space. I do want to keep this pretty informal. Please don't be shy with your questions. I've got some jokes, some cool slides. I hope everyone who is on Zoom is laughing. I miss seeing people and missing my audience, but this will be fun. So let's go. Science policy, what is it? Well, national science policy refers to the set of federal rules, regulations, methods, practices, and guidelines under which scientific research is conducted. And so there is both policy for science and science for policy. And I'm not going to read the definitions off of the slides for you, but it's important to know that both of these do exist and that they are different. There's definitely a tension between them and that we need to be mindful and respectful. So in essence, policy for science, decision-making about how we put together policies to ultimately fund what science is conducting and how it is conducted, and science for policy, so essentially doing science that can then inform new policies or future policies. So really, what is the value add of science? What is the so what? What is the why? Why are we doing all of this science? It's really because science greatly impacts our health, our economic security, and our national security, and really are key to America being a leader in the world. And I should say this is both in wartime and peacetime. However, as we're seeing so much more now, and I know a lot of you are at MIT where every other word is artificial intelligence and entrepreneurship, we have all of these new technologies. And it's so important to come up with standards and new policies and regulations to really make sure that these new technologies are harnessed for good. A lot of them have dual uses. And so I just want to take a quick moment to say it is so important to think about the effects and implications of science and of technology on society. And this is something that is not lost on the scientific and the science policy community right now. And I think so many of us are so excited that Dr. Alondra Nelson was recently appointed as the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy Deputy Director for Science and Society. So she will be thinking about the societal implications of science and technology. And I think we are all so much better off for having her in that role. So here you see Bill again. Bill made an appearance in Jack's remarks. I swear we didn't coordinate. But I also wanted to share this slide because it's important to remember that science is ultimately just one input into the whole process of how policy is made. And you can see the sausage making in the background. There are a lot of analogies of legislation making and sausage making. And frankly, this was something that I learned while on Capitol Hill. In a lot of my prior roles, I had thought about science and technology and engineering all day. And on the Hill, there's definitely a tension. You know, yes, members love science, they appreciate science, but science is one of many competing inputs. And you can see some of them here. And I also want to briefly mention the importance of coalition building, which again, I'll speak more to later. Before I move on, just want to briefly mention science diplomacy, which is really using science in support of building international relationships. And there was just a big workshop at the National Academies about using science diplomacy for more international collaborations with respect to basic research. So this is something that I think will become more and more important due to globalization, due to our research collaborations with China, with the EU post-Brexit, with the UK post-Brexit. So really, again, thinking about how science can be a tool, but also, again, emphasizing the importance of these international collaborations and how they really lead us to the best science. And one brief example I'll mention that I'm sure is on everyone's minds. I mean, look at the Pfizer and BioNTech vaccine, and even Moderna for that case. Just all of the international scientists that came together to make those two mRNA vaccines happen. Amazing, and a testament again to the value of international science and international scientific collaborations. So on to our next pillar, science policy. What are the emergent issues? What is going on right now in 2021? Well, I think we're all pretty much still stuck at home due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And on that note, I should say I don't have a slide explicitly on the COVID-19 pandemic, but I mean, its impacts are just marked from the science that we're doing to get out of the pandemic, the impact on scientists and engineers and researchers on account of the pandemic. This really, as you'll see in my next few times, it is leading, to winds of change are present to think about how we can do science differently and better. So, okay, this is my favorite slide in my whole deck, and I hope everybody online is a scientist or engineer and gets it. This is my new favorite New York Times caption ever. We are putting the YGB in Roy G. Biv. And so the whole reason I have this slide is the biggest thing happening in science policy right now. We have a new administration in town. And along with that, we have a new Congress, the 117th Congress, and they are here. They want to build back better. And that includes science. And I know some of you have seen some of the debate over the past few days about research and development. Well, R&D is infrastructure. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But again, just want to start off, there's a new administration in town. And again, really the potential to revisit things and take a new look at some things and think about how we can do science better. So with this new administration, we have a new team working on science. And so again, many of you may have seen this before. I will briefly point out a few folks on this slide. So Dr. Eric Lander, who has appointments with MIT and Harvard and is coming from the Broad Institute, has been nominated. However, he still needs to go through his Senate confirmation to be President Biden's science advisor, which means he will be the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. His position has also been elevated to the cabinet level for the first time. So he will be a member of President Biden's cabinet once he is confirmed by the Senate. Again, you see Dr. Alondra Nelson, who is a deputy director at OSTP. And then you see reading PCAST, we have Nobel laureate Frances Arnold and Dr. Maria Zuber, who's actually the vice president for research at MIT and gave a phenomenal presentation to the graduate women at MIT Leadership Conference this past Monday. So again, we have this great new team that is very focused on science, how we can build back better, and the societal implications of science. So moving right along, what is this new team's marching orders? So before I get quite into that, we're going to pause for a second. So you see science, the endless frontier. I keep my version nearby at all times. So what is science, the endless frontier? Well, frankly, it's a really important report that was written by Vannevar Bush, who was in effect President Franklin Roosevelt's science advisor during World War II. He was very much in charge of the wartime effort in support of science. So using science to help the United States get out of World War II. And after the war, FDR came to him and really gave him a charge to look at that scientific effort for peacetime. Science played such a major role, in getting out of the war. FDR asked Vannevar Bush to write a report outlining science policy for the post-war era. And I should mention that Vannevar Bush also has MIT ties. But really, this has been kind of the guiding vision for science and science policy in the United States since 1950. And it still is very relevant. It contains very important ideas. But when President Biden asked Dr. Lander to be his science advisor, he sent him a letter, which is what you see on the other side of the screen. And I won't read it to you, but President Biden effectively charged Dr. Lander to look at Science, the Endless Frontier, and to update it for the 21st century and the next 75 years of science. And so quickly, I do want to go over the 5 questions that President Biden posed to Dr. Lander. So public health, COVID-19. How do we get out of COVID-19? What can we do better coming out of COVID-19? Again, things like mRNA vaccines. How can we ensure that that basic research in the life sciences is funded? I mean, that is such a perfect example. We had this basic research, it was funded, it was the seed corn, and we were able to, bam, turn it into effective vaccines to conquer the pandemic. Second question, climate change. I'm really convinced there is no bigger, no more important issue right now. And I'm sure many folks on the line are very interested in how do we tackle climate change. It's really going to need to be a whole of government approach, frankly. And I'm very excited to see what happens and what headway we can make in the coming years. Other questions, industries of the future. Again, going back to these new emergent critical technologies. How do we ensure our economic and national security going forward? Finally, I've already mentioned this a little bit. We are just at such an inflection point with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion in science. How can we ensure that the fruits of science and technology are fully shared across America, so not concentrated in Silicon Valley and Cambridge and, the obvious places where science is taking place, but really everywhere, and have more regional innovation hubs? And among all Americans, how do we encourage more folks from underrepresented communities to pursue careers in STEM? The National Science Board in particular, their Vision 2030 looks at the missing millions. How do we develop both more domestic talent, but also remain a destination of choice for the best and brightest from abroad? And that all dovetails into the 5th question, which is ensuring the long-term health of science and technology. How do we continue to invest? What do we invest in? How do we do science differently? Again, thinking very strategic about science and where we go from here. So every time I look at Science Magazine online right now, recently, there's a new story about President Biden and what's going on with respect to new potential proposed investments in R&D. And the one thing I want to let everyone know, this is all so fluid. It's changing, there's so much going on, but this is why it's also a very exciting time, because this administration has shown a real commitment to science. to funding science. And really, this is a once in a generational chance, again, to leverage Vannevar Bush's vision and ideas and to update them for the 21st century and building the scientific enterprise back better post-COVID-19. So again, if you didn't believe me, it doesn't end at science. This is the Hill, 2 more op-eds. And want to point out in particular, the one on the right side of the screen, which is by NSF Director, Dr. Sethuraman Panchanathan. He was actually not on the first slide because he came on board to NSF as the director in 2020, and that's a fixed 6-year term, but he is another very, very important person in the S&T policy space that you'll be hearing a lot from. And so continuing on, again, another editorial. This one comes from Bob Kahn, who recently stepped down as the president and CEO of the Kavli Foundation. Again, philanthropy is very interested and funds a lot of science as well. And again, a rare moment to enhance the nation's research enterprise. So again, the Endless Frontier. There was a big symposium right before the start of COVID-19 at the National Academies, but that really kind of spurred some of the thinking about, again, how do we bring the community together? How do we build a coalition, bring all the stakeholders, and think about this better? And so again, Senator Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader now, has been very active with his Endless Frontier Act and with the CHIPS Act. And I think ultimately this is, again, a very fluid space, but also a very exciting space where, definitely be on the lookout to see what happens here in the next few weeks or month or two. So there is the Endless Frontier Act, which is Senator Schumer's bill. It was introduced in the 116th Congress in both the Senate and the House. We are hearing it will be reintroduced imminently in the 117th Congress, starting out in the Senate. And this piece of legislation really says $100 billion for NSF over 5 years, in addition to the current funding levels. It creates a new technology and innovation directorate at NSF. And that's really focused on 11 initial key technology focus areas. There's also a provision in the current piece of legislation from the 116th that with respect to regional technology hubs through the Department of Commerce. So again, how do we ensure that science is in all of America? And then the NSF for the Future Act, which was very recently introduced in the House, quite similar, frankly, to Endless Frontier. And again, very curious to see what happens with these two bills. $73 billion for NSF in the next 5 years. And this bill in particular creates a new directorate for science and engineering solutions at NSF. And then instead of 11 key technology areas, there are 5 focus areas that are based upon things like climate change, global competitiveness, cybersecurity. So again, this is a really fluid space. It's really exciting. Be on the lookout for further developments and again, to see even how this dovetails with other legislation and policy plans that are out there. So again, the American Rescue Plan, which has been signed into law by President Biden, $600 million for NSF, $150 million for NIST. The American Jobs Plan, which the administration really presented at the very end of March. And actually right before I signed on to Zoom for this, I saw Speaker Pelosi say this probably won't happen until later in the summer, but it's a top priority, frankly, for Congress. And again, the American Rescue Plan, really focusing on changing the course of the pandemic, building a bridge towards economic recovery and investing in racial justice. And the American Jobs Plan, that's really infrastructure. So again, infrastructure, R&D, long-term healthcare, again, so much exciting stuff going on right now. From the American Jobs Plan, I thought this was a great quote. Again, how do we lay the seed corn, both for the basic research that can then be translated into applied research and ultimately yield new jobs, new cures, new companies. And again, the imperative of really investing now. This isn't an investment that can wait until the future. It's something that we need to do sooner than later. And again, there's been a lot of discussion about the amount of percentage, of GDP that we invest in science. And so you can see it's kind of been going down. There have been a few blips, but how can we really put this on an upward trend? So one other thing I would be remiss not to mention while we're talking about legislation, and Jack covered some of this, so it shouldn't be all new. It's almost time for the FY22 budget. I believe the latest word is that the president's budget request may be coming out tomorrow. Again, don't quote me on that. Very fluid, changes all the time. Full details are likely to be out in May. Again, this is just delayed during a year when you have a new administration coming into office. And as Jack said, the president proposes and Congress disposes. This is so true. Also have this slide, which Jack shared earlier as well. Again, just showing the breadth of stakeholders that are really involved in proposing policy and the president's budget process and getting the budget to the finish line. It's not just Congress, so it's the executive branch. You have all of the executive branch stakeholders, including the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Office of Management and Budget, and then as you see here, all of the science funding agencies, among other funding agencies. That's enough about legislation and budget. Let's switch gears a little bit and go into advocacy tips. So really, sustained, effective advocacy for science that serves the public interest is essential. And again, there's been so much focus right now on science that solves societal problems, everything from COVID-19 to climate change. But how can we do more use-inspired research? So perhaps basic research that is ultimately done with a lens on being applicable someday to solving a societal problem. Also, I cannot overemphasize the importance of presenting clear, science-based messages to policymakers and to the broader public. We'll talk about that in a split second as well, on the value of scientific knowledge that results from well-funded research. So again, just a very basic framework here. There are different types of involvement: local involvement, political involvement, very targeted science policy involvement. And so we'll touch upon a lot of what you see here in the upcoming slides. So science communication is so important, and there really is a wealth of resources available. Public affairs and government relations offices are invaluable. For those at MIT, the MIT Washington, D.C. office is absolutely excellent, and they are standing by. They work with, they engage, they support graduate students. Science journalists, again, I've mentioned science. There are so many publications. We'll talk about more even in a second. And science communication toolkits. One of that's particularly of interest is Compass and their message box tool for really honing in on your message and what you want to say about your research or your science. And so don't underestimate the value of storytelling and finding common interest as a key to success. So again, so important to know your audience, know who you're talking to, and present a compelling case that will resonate with them. One example I do love to mention here, I heard a story about some faculty members at Ohio State that were actually going to a farmer's market and rented a table and were just kind of, doing very basic science experiments, making slime. But the whole point was to get people to come up to them and talk and, realize that science is cool and, also talk about the benefits that science can have. So again, a few real-time examples that we are seeing right in the world right now. Again, I said I was going to keep this lighthearted. Dolly. I mean, if you haven't seen the video of Dolly Parton getting her Moderna vaccine, it is just tremendous and a true testament to everything that science communication should be. And also so important to thank Dolly because as you see on the right side of the screen, she's donated money to medical research at Vanderbilt that really helped fund the early stages of the Moderna vaccine. So again, just wanted to share this. I love that she's been so open with getting her shots and engaging with the media. Just really phenomenal. Related COVID-19 efforts, and these all come from Stat News, which has done some amazing reporting. How do we reach people where they're at? How do we come to them and overcome vaccine skepticism and encourage people, particularly from different racial and ethnic minority groups, that they should get the vaccine? It is in their best interests. And so again, having people like faith leaders, like clergy, speak out about why they are getting vaccinated and why their flock, their congregation might want to. And again, really coming up with science communication guides for, if you're talking with someone who is skeptical about getting vaccinated, best practices, because again, you want to have a conversation with them and listen and understand their concerns, and then provide evidence and facts and talk about, again, personal stories. Why did you choose to get vaccinated? And really emphasize the benefits to yourself and your community. One more slide on COVID. Barber shops, another place where people go and they chat and they hear what's up in the neighborhood. Another place where there really can be key engagement with respect to meeting people where they're at and encouraging them to get vaccinated. Again, while we're talking about science, just a quick shout out to some of the real champions during this pandemic, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Corvette, who have both been so generous with their time and engaging with the public in so many ways, in so many places. Also want to give a shout out to Alan Alda. Hopefully there's at least a few of you here who remember him from MASH, but his kind of second career, his second calling in his later life has been science communication. And he has this great science communication center, the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. And they do a lot of trainings. In fact, literally before I signed on to Zoom, they're doing a free training, I believe, open to the public, including graduate students later this month, about how to engage with policymakers. That looks awesome. And they actually incorporate a lot of best practices from improv, about listening, about being open, and doing your yes and. And so again, I love the Alda Center's banner, which is building trust to share the wonders of science. Again, this is all about building relationships. This is all about trust. So pivoting a tiny bit, again, Divyansh mentioned a lot of this, getting to know your local, state, federal elected officials, follow them, engage with them on social media, tweet at them, thank them for supporting science, visit them in their district. All Congress people have at least one office in their state or their district, and invite them to come see your campus or your lab. But really, again, work in conjunction with your university's public affairs and government relations offices. A lot of times they have relationships and best practices that you can leverage. And Divyansh said this as well, but I really just want to hit home. Elected officials love hearing from graduate students about their research and its impact. You all are the next generation of scientists and engineers. You are the people working on this cutting edge technology that will ultimately solve our future scientific problems. So to that end, if you haven't already, I would very much encourage you to participate in the Congressional Visit Day. These are put on by disciplinary societies. There's a big one. I don't know if it's happened yet. It usually happens late March, early April. Science, Engineering, Technology, SET, CVD. Again, right now, this is all virtual. So the barrier to entry is quite low. You can participate from anywhere. And beyond this, hopefully once we're back in person again, organized advocacy events are quite fun. And so things like the Rally for Medical Research and the March for Science. Again, great opportunities to come together with fellow scientists and engineers and really, again, share what's important to you. A quick slide on some advice for Hill meetings. And again, this holds both if you're on Zoom or if you're in person. Know your audience. And so I think Divyansh said, odds that you're probably going to meet with a member of Congress, him or herself, they're pretty low. Hate to burst your bubble. But if you are able to see them, it's super cool, and definitely get a photo that you can put on social media. But instead, be very respectful of the staffer or whoever is taking the time out of his or her day to meet with you. Recognize he or she or they probably don't have a science or engineering background. So again, this goes to jargon, to speak in terms that can be understood and listen. First and foremost, though, I will say it's important to formulate a clear message with a clear ask. Again, know your bottom line up front. If you are able to get a minute with a member of Congress, what is the one thing you want him or her to know? I want you to sign on and co-sponsor this bill. I want you to fund more research for MSF. Know that one thing. Make it personal. Why does this matter to you? If this funding goes away, can you still do the science that you want to do? Is there some tie to the district or state keeping the Great Lakes clean, doing research on algae and algal blooms in Lake Erie? And most important, and Divyansh has said this as well, build a relationship. Don't make this a one-time thing. Email a thank you note, do a leave behind. We'll talk about that more in a second, but really, keep up with them, say, hey, I was so pleased to see your senators signed on to this bill as a co-sponsor, or I want you to know there's been this new legislative or regulatory development. So really, again, keep in touch, build a relationship, build a rapport. This is what will be valuable to you for being an advocate in the future. And so I want to share, this is super old. This was actually a leave behind from when I did a congressional visit day with the MIT Science Policy Initiative, which is the Student Science Policy Group. I believe this is now probably 6 years old. I guess I'm getting old. So don't put too much stock into the numbers here. But again, we have a very clear and compelling ask. We want these members of Congress to invest in America's future and fund more research. We're all grad students, we're all doing research. And I do have to say, just because I love it, America does run on science. Please excuse the Dunkin' Donuts pun, but I think it's magnificent. And so you can see the other slide, again, we wanted clear visuals, not too much text. Why does this matter for you? Why does it impact your district? Again, how does it impact health and economic and national security? Because again, that's the why for why we do science. Although again, basic science, discovering things to discover and have this new knowledge is super awesome as well. And what ultimately translates into, again, health, economic, national security. Oh, and this was the highlight of that Congressional Visit Day. This was a really amazing group of MIT women, and we got to meet Senator Elizabeth Warren herself. And it was really just a delight and a privilege. So the last part, and I do hope to have some time for questions here at the end, next steps. So hopefully you've sat through Jack's presentation, you've sat through Divyansh's, you've now listened to me talk for 40 minutes. So what? If you're liking this, I have some things you might want to consider. So first and foremost, I want to say that as grad students, your advocacy matters and has had impact. On the left here, you see the amicus brief, the friend of the court brief that Divyansh actually spoke to a little bit ago. This was when we had all of the immigration bans and issues over the summer, particularly when DHS Acting Secretary Chad Wolf had made changes to the student and exchange visitor program. And so again, there was so much advocacy with respect to rescinding these potentially very harmful changes. And I believe it's 13 or 16 institutions on this brief. And then the other letter on the right, which I know it's a bit of an eye chart, please forgive me. Again, it's something like 43 schools that came together to encourage the 117th Congress to pursue bipartisan immigration reform. And so again, you're not just all doing this, throwing it into a void, doing it, it has real impact. Your voices are important. And so on that note, a few things you can do while you're still in grad school, or these frankly hold for early career researchers, early career faculty, postdocs. I even still do most of the things on this list. So Divyansh had mentioned, if you're going to read and subscribe to one newsletter, make it the American Institute of Physics and their Science Policy FYI newsletter. Everything that's going on in the community is in that newsletter. The book of choice is, again, Science, the Endless Frontier. There's also Beyond Sputnik, which you see here. And there's a really robust community of science policy professionals and enthusiasts that are on Twitter. So if you don't have a Twitter account, really encourage you to get a Twitter account and follow. One of the main hashtags is #SciPol. So we would love to have more graduate students, again, on Twitter, engaging, joining the conversation. And that's really where you can hear about a lot of these new articles, legislative developments, and opportunities to engage or do cool things. So again, honing your communication skills, come up with your elevator speech. What is your research in one sentence? Write an op-ed. What does your science say about policy? Use language that resonates with the public. Again, we're bridging the communications gap between scientists and engineers and policymakers. Get rid of that jargon. Very important to acknowledge funding agencies and sponsors on posters and in presentations. And again, there's a Twitter hashtag for this too, #SciComm. So a few places you can write while you're still in grad school, and I know Divyansh mentioned this as well, but again, loving the op-ed, by MIT grad student Austin DeMarco, which was published in Inside Higher Ed. Other places you might want to look: Issues in Science and Technology, JSPG, which is particularly geared to early career researchers, the MIT Science Policy Review, which is getting ready to send out its second issue, and I know Jordan and many on the line are very involved with. But last but not least, your local paper, where you grew up, where you're in grad school. People look up to you, people know you, people you respect you. Tell them why either your research is important or even why you're getting vaccinated. Again, all politics are local, so go after that local impact. A few more places to write if you're like, formal publication, op-ed, not for me. If you want to work on your writing skills, the place to go is the NPR SciCommers. Joe Palka and his crew are amazing. They have office hours. They will help you with your writing. They've had, I think last time I checked, 50, but I want to say maybe closer to 70, 80, 90 now, op-eds by grad students, postdocs, and early career researchers get published. So they are the people if you want to work on your writing. Two other places I want to mention: the Golden Goose Awards, which is a joint endeavor by the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a few other organizations that really seeks to celebrate and recognize silly sounding basic research funded by the federal government. And you can nominate someone to receive a Golden Goose Award. It's quick, it's easy. I've nominated people, and they've found some really amazing nominees that, you scratch your head and you're like, well, yes, this sounds silly, but it had amazing impact. They discovered something that went on to save lives, or again, mRNA vaccines, really get us out of this pandemic. Finally, you might want to look into the Day One Project, which is really crafting new policy proposals for the Biden administration to consider, and that is open to anyone. There have been a number of undergrads and grad students that have submitted proposals on their own or in conjunction with other folks and organizations in the science policy space. Speaking of these organizations, some organizations you can join while you're still in grad school or not in grad school as well. Again, really want to encourage everyone, if you're not already involved with the MIT Science Policy Initiative or the Science Policy Group at your school. Again, these are the people who are in the know, who care about this, and they can really help you get involved. I've talked about AAAS a lot, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Their Catalyzing Advocacy in Science and Engineering workshop is not to be missed. And they sometimes do run specials for student membership, so keep an eye out for those. Get involved in your disciplinary society. A lot of disciplinary societies have policy committees, or R&D policy committees, government affairs committees, and that's an opportunity where you can both leverage your technical or disciplinary expertise and contribute to policy problems and your disciplinary society's advocacy strategy. And there are other science policy and advocacy groups. You see 4 here: NSPN, ESEP, ESAL, and the Union of Concerned Scientists. Again, these are all a little bit different, but all amazing groups you might want to look into. So if this really sounds interesting to you, just a quick slide on science policy careers. Fellowships are really a main avenue for entry. Probably the most biggest famous one is the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. Another great reason to join AAAS. These fellowships place fellows in both the legislative and the executive branch. There are additional fellowship opportunities kind of under the AAAS umbrella via disciplinary societies. So again, what I did as the IEEE Congressional Fellow going to Capitol Hill, I think there's roughly 30 disciplinary societies that sponsor fellows on the Hill and elsewhere. The National Academies has their Merzion Fellowship, which is really beloved by graduate students. You spend 12 weeks at the National Academies. Not sure if they're currently still open for applications. I believe it's usually in the January to April timeframe. I think they're looking late summer. I know they really want to be in person, but it might be virtual. And I know I haven't said anything about the National Academies yet, really, but they're a very key stakeholder in the science policy ecosystem of sorts, and really engage with all of the government, university, industry stakeholders and drive a lot of this nonpartisan policy work and research. There are state policy fellowship programs, the most famous of which is California, but frankly, they're popping up everywhere, and there have been some amazing opportunities. And another great way to cut your teeth on science policy, especially if coming to DC might not be in the cards for you. And finally, the Civic Science Fellows Program, brand new. This places fellows at some different nonprofit organizations, some philanthropic organizations, definitely something to keep an eye out for if you want to engage from a slightly different angle. And so again, get on Twitter, #SciPolJobs. So I think this is my last slide. So we'll have roughly 15 minutes for questions. Just some career advice, and I think Divyansh frankly already said this: network, network, network. Be gracious and humble, say thank you, realize you might have to start at the bottom to get where you want to be, listen, know what angle from which you want to or can engage, know your why. Why did you pursue the science or engineering research that you're pursuing? Why do you want to engage in science policy? If you could wave a magic wand and change one policy or regulation, what would it be? Why are you passionate about it? And finally, again, I know I've said it like 3 times in the last 5 minutes, get on Twitter and join the conversation there. So that's all for me for today. Thank you for listening. Again, it's been a great honor. Thank you again to Divyansh and Benjamin and Jack and Jordan and everyone for inviting me. And I am delighted to take your questions. Thanks again.
We can't hear you, Ben.
About now, I locally mute. I double muted as like a safety. I said, thank you, Sarah. That was a really great talk. I personally learned a lot, and I feel like I'm fairly plugged into science policy already. So that just shows like your expertise, I think. If people have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A like section of the Zoom webinar. I think we have at least one question already. I don't know if this is directed specifically at you, Sarah, or broadly at like some of the advocacy groups, but it's, does your program work with undergraduates to collaborate on projects/educational workshops? So I guess I'll let you answer that however you feel first.
Does my program work with undergraduates?
Yeah. I think the antecedent there is a bit confusing.
Right. I'm not quite sure how to answer this, frankly. And so again, today I'm speaking in a personal capacity, and I should have mentioned that at the beginning. I currently run a one-woman science policy consulting firm. There are programs out there that will engage with undergraduates. Again, I would say if you're an undergraduate and you're very interested, my best advice would be to link up with your institution's science policy group and again, see what connections they might have. And again, through some of the organizations that are mentioned, particularly I will say NSPN, the National Science Policy Network, and ESEP, Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy. If you go to their sites, there are resources that I believe you can filter to see either specific organizations or fellowships or internships that are particularly geared towards undergrads. That's not really, I know this individual specifically asking about collaborating on projects and educational workshops. Afraid I don't really have any super detailed insight there. I will say one cool opportunity that is open to folks coming out of undergrad, I would encourage you to take a look. This one is a US citizenship required, but the Institute for Defense Analysis, their Science and Technology Policy Institute, does do this great 2-year fellowship after folks get their bachelor's degree in science or engineering that can really allow you to be a part of STIPI. And they're practically a think tank for the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy. And so I know a number of people that have gone through that fellowship program and then have gone on to grad school, whether in science policy and something else, but that could be a really cool opportunity for those who are still in undergrad and are very interested.
Yeah, and I guess I would say briefly from the advocacy side, definitely reach out to your like graduate student government counterparts if you have one at your university. Likely they're either doing some kind of external advocacy or thinking about doing some, so they can certainly connect you. The landscape is different at every university, so I can't give like super specifics, but like at MIT, there's the Science Policy Initiative. There's the MIT Graduate Student Council External Affairs Board. And then there's also the Government Relations Office, which we work with a lot. That's very helpful. So figuring out what the landscape is and then just getting in touch, because I'm sure people would love to collaborate broadly. So another question, I see somebody made a comment on politics and media in an era of technology. I guess, do you have any comments on like kind of this rise of like the changing landscape of both communications and media and how technology and science and all of this is kind of playing together? It's a bit of a vague question, but
it is a vague question, and there, oh my gosh, there is so much here to unpack, both, you know, with respect to the news cycle and how that's kind of driving politics right now. Frankly, I think it's a little less frantic right now than it has been. But, you know, again, people are constantly engaging on Twitter. You can have CNN on all day. I think with respect to technology, now is also an interesting time, speaking from like the very pure tech policy space, which is really not my expertise personally by any means. But there have been so many hearings on big tech, on Section 230, net neutrality, and again, how do we regulate all of this? Because ultimately, we do want to harness technology for good. And so I know that's a bit of a different angle here. But I want to say, kind of outside of the science policy space, there is a ton going on in the tech policy space.
And maybe like a slightly related question to that, though, do you feel like less on the technology policy side, but do you feel like the increase in technology has like helped make it easier for scientists to communicate with potentially like policymakers or amongst each other? I mean, SciComm, we've certainly seen a kind of rise in that, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on some of that interplay.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And I mean, right now, this has to be one of the silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic. You don't have to come to Capitol Hill. You don't have to go to your state capitol. You can do a Zoom meeting from home with your pajama pants still on. But just the barrier has been lowered so much. And again, I know there really is a lot going on right now legislatively and that Congress is working on. But again, that barrier has really been lowered. And yes, you know, Zoom meetings aren't as fun as real life in-person meetings, but again, you know, you can do one during the course of your day. You can take a lunchtime Zoom meeting. So it's that much easier to kind of set aside a much smaller bit of time. Beyond that, I mean, I know I just had my 10-year Twitter anniversary. You know, 10 years ago, Twitter wasn't really a thing. I guess I've been on Facebook longer. So, you know, 15, 20 years ago, Facebook wasn't a thing. But thinking about, again, when I worked for Mr. Moulton, we did a lot of Facebook town halls. We posted on Facebook and Twitter. It really is another avenue to engage. Maybe you don't feel quite ready yet to do a Zoom meeting with your member of Congress or his or her staff, but you're okay ripping off a tweet, even, postcards, writing postcards to your members. But again, just taking the time and sharing why this matters to you and why it should matter to them, or particularly what is the hook with respect to your state, with respect to your district. There really is value there. And I guess in summary, this is saying that yes, technology, I think, has provided more opportunities to engage and has very much lowered the barrier to engage.
Yeah, it's funny also you should mention Facebook not being a thing, because I think it's actively not a thing since Facebook and Instagram are actually down right now.
Oh, they are? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so very timely, but maybe
technology.
Yeah, exactly, right? There's some of the dangers, and maybe they need better infrastructure for Facebook.
Well, hey, I mean, infrastructure is the word right now.
Infrastructure year.
So it is.
So maybe one last question with some of the time we have remaining, if nobody else has one. So you've gone through graduate school, you've seen policy from the policymaker side and from the advocate side, I guess. Where would you, or how would you feel like, what's the right way to phrase this, I guess? Where do you feel like the graduate students and undergraduate students have like a unique voice in some of this policy? So not just people that are doing science, but like unique, separate from maybe some of the other researchers. Do you feel like there's a value in that? And can you speak to that a little bit about why it's important?
I mean, I think this is really what Divyansh hit on earlier. Think about the issues that are very unique to you. So things like, NSF career awards, grants, stipends for graduate students. Going back to that friend of the court brief, when all the proposed changes to the student exchange visitor program were proposed. I mean, graduate students were the people uniquely impacted by those proposed policies. Your lives are the lives that would change. And so again, I think anything that uniquely touches graduate students, but even more broadly, again, elected officials love hearing from graduate students. Tell them about, your research. Why is your research cool? Just because you are the next generation of scientists and engineers. You're the people that are going to get us out of future pandemics. You're the people that are going to solve climate change, cure cancer. I mean, they want to invest time in you because you're going to move us forward ultimately.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Well, I guess we can go ahead and I guess wrap this up if nobody else has any questions. But I think hearing your perspective on science policy with the path that you've taken is definitely very enlightening, because I guess it's just
have a hand up. I don't know if Jasmine has another question.
Hand is
down.
Down
okay.
now. Okay. I mean, if people have any questions, we still have 3 minutes, so definitely feel free to put it in the chat.
And again, network, I'm always happy to chat if folks are interested. Again, thank you all. Oh, it's in the Q&A. Okay, we got it in the Q&A. All right. Thank you all for being here. It really means a lot that you take an hour out of your time to listen. And again, I think this is just such a fun and impactful space that, really profoundly impacts society and individual lives. Because again, science, really drives health, economic security, national security.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for taking an hour of your time to come and speak to us and help inform all of us. And hopefully we'll be able to take that knowledge and be able to further our own advocacy efforts for the good of the nation as a whole, really, at the end of the day. So thank you. We will, I guess, just take a short 2-minute break while we get the panelists ready for our staffer panel at 6, but definitely stick around for that. It's going to be a very interesting group of people from a diverse range of offices. Senate and House, some committee, some personal offices. So we'll see you in, I guess, 1 minute while I sort that out. Thank you, Sarah.